It's always a tricky question to ask what is the most gruesome, bleakest, ugliest, nastiest Stephen King story, because we're not short on supply. But over the many years I've covered King's work, The Raft is perhaps the most deceptively simple yet gruelingly unpleasant short story in his repertoire. The Raft tells the story of four college friends who decide to take an impromptu trip to a secluded lake before it freezes over for winter. But as luck would have it, upon swimming to a raft right in the center of the lake, they discover a mysterious oil slick that slowly dissolves and devours anyone who touches it. The Raft was originally published in an adult magazine in 1982, before releasing as part of King's absolutely brilliant Skeleton Crew anthology in 1985, which also contains many other worthwhile sinister short stories, like The Mist, The Jaunt, Survivor Type, and The Monkey, which was recently adapted into a film by Longlegs director Oz Perkins. However, you're perhaps most likely familiar with The Raft from its adaptation in 1987's Creepshow 2, but I'm going to be upfront and say that while the film version scared the ever-loving piss out of me as a child and gave me shivering trauma from touching water moss or seaweed with my bare skin, it is nowhere near as emotionally evocative as the short story. Creepshow 2 as a whole is an unsatisfying wet fart of an anthology film, dare I say one of the worst in fact, because it feels cheaply and half-heartedly put together, and the fact it only has three rather milquetoast duds makes it feel like segments cut from the original film, which to be honest, I'm not much of a fan of either. But I know what some die-hard horror fans might be thinking. Ryan, The Raft sounds like a taster course for the shockingly grotesque 1988 remake of The Blob, and well, yes, the Blob remake is arguably the better cinematic adaptation of this concept, but it still doesn't match the somber tone of King's short story. While I will primarily be focusing on the short story to give you the most vivid context of King's creation, I will also be using the film for the visual foundation of this review, so regardless of what you see, brace yourself. Now, before we dive deeper into despair, this video is sponsored by Vezi. With spring fast approaching and my fingers crossed for better weather, I can tell you for a fact there is no better shoe I can recommend than Vezi Weekend Sneaker. I've accumulated about 6 pairs of these bad boys over the last 4.5 years, in addition to gifting them to my fiance, my dad, and best friend, because I cannot understate how stylish, comfortable, and versatile to any weather or occasion Vezi Weekend Sneakers are. Whether it be casual formal, walking your dog, meeting up with friends or family, or simply running a couple of errands, weekend sneakers are an all-in-one, all-day wear thanks to their soft, lightweight, breathable, 100% waterproof material, which is especially beneficial when dealing with more strenuous activities in life. With an effortless slip-on design for a get-up-and-go lifestyle, I can leave weekend sneakers by my door or by my bedside to help make the spontaneity of my own life just that little bit easier, and take the hassle out of preparing for whatever the weather or my schedule may throw at me unexpectedly. Wherever the day takes you, Vezi's got you covered. You can support my channel today by visiting vezi.com/ryanhollinger to make every step an adventure and enjoy an instant 15% off your first order at checkout. And once you do, let me know which style you get. Now, just to give you a background tangent for shits and giggles, in the author notes of Skeleton Crew, King explained that The Raft was technically a remake of his original 1960 manuscript entitled The Float. What happened was, King first sold it to another adult magazine in 1969, and one night, whilst driving home drunk, he damaged his Ford station wagon, crashing into several traffic cones, prompting him to steal around 150 other cones and leave them outside a police station as some sort of statement, leading to a fine of $250 for petty larceny. However, being a broke college student, this story ended up being what King describes as a Deus Ex Machina when he received a check from that magazine for $250 that covered the entire fine, although to his own frustration to this day, King has yet to ever find a copy of that original publication. The Raft was conceived in 1981 during post-production on the original Creepshow, and according to King's recollection, while the story was still structurally identical to The Float, it now had considerably more gnarly detail. Set in October near Halloween, the story begins with the college friends arriving at the lake and commencing their swim, before flashing back to our protagonist's college dorm a few hours prior, where the spontaneous trip initiated. While the 20-minute segment in Creepshow 2 focuses purely on the events surrounding the mysterious creature and doesn't give the characters much personality, King's version sets up a remarkably complicated relationship between them. The dynamic between them basically works like this. You have Randy, who has a crush on Laverne, but is jealous of the fact that her gaze is squarely on his best friend Deke, who's currently dating Rachel, yet seems to also have a slightly flirtatious edge towards Laverne himself, which Rachel later seems glued into. With this OMG romantic tension in effect, it seems to have strained Randy and Deke's once inseparable companionship, which is consolidated in how they constantly refer to each other throughout as Cisco and Pancho from the 1950s Western television series, which in turn also says a lot about the hierarchy in their friendship, where Cisco was the leader and Pancho was merely his sidekick. As such, Randy, being Pancho, has grown resentful of being in Deke's shadow, and feels a need to compete in a contest of bravado as if to prove something. In fact, it directly paints them as the stereotypical unlikely duo of jock and nerd, with the latter harboring angst at the fact he's not respected on the same level as his friend and peer. Now, already I know for a fact I've lost people by not addressing the horror itself, but it's important to understand how King conveys a lot with so little compared to the film, which omits every interesting theme and characterization simply to get to the gore. The flashback in King's story goes a significant way in greatening the impact of the horror, with how it approaches this very loose yet poignant theme about the end of summer, where Rachel laments about summer going by faster and faster as she gets older, before reminiscing on the titular Raft she frequently visited during her childhood, and the fond, loving memories it gave her. Randy claims the Raft is still out there as he saw it during a field trip 3 weeks prior, and poetically describes it as a little bit of summer that somebody forgot to clean up and put away in the closet until next year. The characters talk with a sort of introspective, carefree spiritedness that almost evokes that symbolic horror genre trope of kids wanting to rebel against societal rules and conservative cultural norms with taboo actions and behaviors. It's written in such a way that it very directly leans on the sins of promiscuity that Elm Street would later explicitly call attention to in 1984, becoming a trend for horror of that era. It's explained that the owners left the Raft out there until the lake freezes over for winter, prompting Randy to suggest a sentimental motive of swimming out to the Raft to say goodbye to summer before snow is expected the following day, despite his own reluctance towards the very idea. As such, dare I say, the Raft itself could be viewed as a sort of twisted symbol of a generation's love for summer and the fragility of youth as you get older and time goes by quicker, as suggested by Rachel. Hell, King's writing irregularly interjects nostalgic-esque reflections of the lake, the glimmering blue light, the texture of the raft, the rocking and creaking sounds it makes amongst the tranquility of the secluded setting. In your head, it paints this idyllic romantic picture of the perfect summer, yet it also reminds you with a shadowy asterisk that the season is long gone and not something we can go back to. Thus, the creature and how it's enigmatically presented effectively becomes a harbinger of that. When Randy first notices the oil slick, the fear he's engulfed with is perfectly described as directionless but powerful. Like the aura of the lake, this strange anomaly triggers a primal instinct in Randy, as he hurries everyone onto the raft before the oil slick can reach them. In the film, it's shown to be a moldy, slimy pool of gore, which suits the tone the film is going for, but in King's version, it's much more subtle, enigmatic, and given lesser description compared to what it actually does to its victims. In many respects, it's akin to Lovecraft's Color Out of Space, where it's given the presence of something vaguely alien, and Oil Slick works because Randy notes its dark, thick, void-like purity. It's described like a black, perfectly circular checker piece floating on the surface of the water, and that's before we even get to its reflective colors within. In fact, just to compound its appearance, the haunting thought Randy tells himself is that it doesn't look like an accident, it looks like it's on purpose. From here, the film focuses on the subtleties and sexual undertones of how the characters interact with each other, blurring a line between romantic gesture and survival instincts, with the ensuing danger and cold, dark weather. Deke and Laverne grow questionably intimate as suspected by Randy and Rachel, who themselves draw closer together only for Rachel to quickly move away to stare at the oil slick and begin gazing at what are apparently hypnotic colours spiraling deep within it. However, upon reaching out in curiosity, rather than the oil slick simply grabbing her like in the film, the black void simply surges up her arm, dissolving everything it touches, before Rachel falls into the water, screaming in agony as she's slowly devoured until only bone remains. From this point forwards, what's interesting is how the characters' demeanors begin to change, as Deke tries to forcefully get everyone under control, even threatening to hit Laverne when she begins crying out in non-stop horror, but Randy notes his continued resentment towards Deke, even questioning if he takes perverse pleasure in seeing Deke expose his vulnerable, insecure side. The colours of the entity only grow more tantalising as it floats closer to the raft, as if tempting its next victim forward, only to soon disappear under the raft. Deke sees this as an opportunity to swim ashore, but before his bravado makes him look a fool, the creature emerges from the slits between the wood and consumes his foot before gradually dragging him down. Believe it or not, the film actually downplays this scene. In the book, it really makes a point about how slow the dissolving process is, or at least how psychologically long it makes it seem. In fact, just to give you a true idea of how King describes it, blood bursts from the pores of Deke's calf and shin. His kneecap had taken on a purple, bulging look as it tried to absorb the tremendous pressure being put on it as the black thing hurled Deke's leg down through the narrow crack, inch by inch. It's gruelingly overplayed for harrowing effect, and it starkly contrasts with the bodily intimacy between the characters described earlier in the story. It goes from uncomfortably sensual in its delivery to outright brutally violent, as though it punishes their promiscuity. When I think about it, Deke's death actually reminds me of David's death in Slugs. Eventually, his head begins bleeding profusely before exploding from hemorrhaging. Blood streamed from both of Deke's ears. His face, a hideous purple turnip, swelled shapeless with the hydrostatic pressure of some unbelievable reversal. It was the face of a man being clutched in a bear hug of monstrous and unknowable force. And then, mercifully, it was over. The psychological horror rises intensely during this, because until Deke's final few fingers slip through the cracks, Randy begins to feel as though time stands still, tormented by his best friend slowly and agonizingly fading into the oblivion of the oil slick. It evokes sadness when Deke's body is finally gone below the raft, by reminiscing on the better times that Deke and Randy shared, regardless of the recent turbulence in their friendship. Randy's resentfulness then seems to latch itself onto Laverne, who constantly refuses to think and act independently for herself, and desperately clings to Randy, who holds her up as the creature tries to slip through the cracks. Hell, Randy even tries to fight off intrusive thoughts about sacrificing Laverne as a distraction so he can save himself. His mind whispered, "Do it anyway, put her down and swim for it." His lust for Laverne has now morphed into wrath, as she falls asleep in his arms as he tries to stand upright on the boards, eventually biting her earlobe until it bleeds to awaken her and get her to stand up for herself as his exhaustion weighs on him. Eventually, the intimacy returns as Randy and Laverne begin touching each other until they reach intercourse, turning the raft into, I swear to God, the world's hardest waterbed. But Randy is constantly reminded to keep his gaze on the creature and not on Laverne. The intimacy is basically loveless. Initially, it's an attempt for them to stay warm, only for their sexual instincts to take over, as though some desperate attempt to spark the romanticism of summer, despite the danger they now put themselves in, hence the theme of sins of promiscuity I mentioned earlier. In fact, gazing into the colours of the creature, it symbolically reminds Randy of summer, and the motive to say goodbye to it. For a moment it's peaceful, a return to idyllic serenity, until realising Laverne's hair has slipped between the cracks and the creature engulfs her. Interestingly, the story doesn't linger on Laverne's death. Randy is instead resigned almost apathetically to it, yet frozen in fear. The story ends with him standing alone in both exhaustion and delirium, gazing at the colours, wondering if its aura would distract him from the pain of being devoured. After a full sleepless night being tormented by the creature, screaming at it to go away, saying he does not love it as though it divinely wants to embrace him as some inverted romantic symbol of summer, he finally gives in and whispers to it, "Do you love?" The story ends with one final harrowing line. Somewhere far across the empty lake, a loon screamed. In other words, he embraces the creature, but he was foolish to believe in the peaceful thought that the colours of summer it projected would distract him from a painful death. Instead, he suffers like the rest of his friends. Now, the film's ending is very different, with the most jarring detail being that because it gives you no psychological context to the intimacy between Randy and Laverne before her death, it's basically played off as sexual assault because he tries to touch her without waking her up, so fuck this guy. Instead, while Laverne is being devoured, Randy does use it as an opportunity to swim ashore, but where I do give the film credit by giving him his comeuppance is when Randy cockily celebrates too early by calling the creature out like he won, only for it to form a wave and pull him in. It's a brilliant fuck you twist, and the no swimming sign seen out of sight is just the cherry on top. And that concludes Stephen King's The Raft. Very simple, yet very effective, evoking so much with so little. If you enjoyed this little detour into short horror stories, let me know in the comments below, and until next time, stay safe, stay away from oil slicks, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.